All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Adams Van Sale, here to shine a light on the goings on down south. And tonight's conversation I've already had in Afrikaans on my Afrikaans channel. As jy enigstens van my inhoud wil hê in Afrikaans, kan jy altyd gaan inskakel daarby in alle erns. Dis ook op YouTube, and you get all my Afrikaans content there as well. But the conversation that me and my guest here tonight had that evening or that day on my Afrikaans channel was so insightful that I needed to also do this in English for my international and also my English-speaking Afrikaans South African audience, because I think it is very important that we have this type of discussion regarding tonight's topic. So tonight's topic specifically is not just a single thing; it's a myriad of topics. The first one is constitutionalism, something that my guest here tonight is a very big expert on. And then I wanted to explore some of the ideas discussed in one of his recent books called There's No Supreme Constitution. But before we get into all of that, welcome on the show, Professor Koos Malan. It's nice to have this conversation with you again, just in a different linguistic format.
Good evening to you, Ernst. It's a great honor for me to be present on your program.
All right. So just a small introduction for you. For those that don't know, you are a professor of public law at the University of Pretoria, and then also the author of Politocracy and There's No Supreme Constitution. And that last book, the latter, There's No Supreme Constitution, is what I want to get into tonight specifically. So the topic tonight, one of the things that you discuss in your book, There's No Supreme Constitution, is the statist individualist constitutionalism. Now, this might be a very technical term, but I think once you start explaining what it is, a lot of people will realize this is the water that they're swimming in. Just like fish don't realize that they live in the ocean, I think a lot of people out there listening don't know that they're living in a statist individualist constitutionalist system. Can you give us an idea in layman's terms about what that entails?
Yeah, Ernst, well put. That is actually the water in which we are swimming. And another word for statist individualist constitutionalism would be liberal constitutionalism. In a nutshell, it boils down to the following. The concept of constitutionalism is a very old one. It's an ancient one. It goes back to Greek philosophy. It goes back to Greek political practice. And as a matter of fact, I think you can actually encounter it in every possible culture that you could possibly think of. But what has been happening over the past around about 220, 230 years, especially since then, the time of enlightenment, is that the concept of constitutionalism has been monopolized, so to say, by statist individualist constitutionalism to such an extent has the monopolization taken place that it is that at the moment statist individualist constitutionalism completely exhausts the very broader idea of constitutionalism as such. All right, that just is a little bit of background. The idea of statist individualist constitutionalism is a description of precisely the only two focal points of statist individualist constitutionalism, namely the state as the embodiment of public power on the one hand, and the individual, the isolated individual, one should say, on the other side. Nothing over and above that is recognized. More specifically, no community, specifically no cultural community, no linguistic community is recognized. One can also add more other communities, but I think especially from a South African point of view, it is important to emphasize that cultural communities are in fact not recognized. The implication of which to my mind are twofold. In the first instance, if you do not recognize communities, then obviously you can also not recognize rights of communities. But even more importantly, you can also not recognize the notion that powers, that is legislative and executive powers, and also other powers, police powers and so on, might be vesting in a community and not so much only in the state. And that rights also not only vest in the state. the individual. Now, the opposite then of statist individualist constitutionalism, or then liberal constitutionalism, would be the notion of multi-communal constitutionalism. Now, perhaps from a European point of view, or even from an American point of view, that would be regarded as anathema. Because many of my Dutch friends, for example, on the conservative side of the political spectrum, would not have any toleration, any toleration for the idea of actually recognizing a multitude of communities within the Dutch setup, because that would actually undermine the very notion of a true Dutch state. But in a situation, in a scenario like South Africa, precisely the opposite applies. South Africa is right from the start a multi-communal setup. So if you do not recognize the multi-communal nature of the South African populace in the constitutional setup, if you do specifically not recognize minority communities, then the effect of that would be to provide for a constitutional system that opens the door and that eventually entrenches majority domination. The only way to actually fend that off, to avoid that, and to make provision for something which fairly make provision for all communities is through also recognizing over and above the state and the individual, specifically also the multi-communal reality.
And Professor, why I think this specific topic that we're talking about here tonight is so important is, and you touched on it now, is I think as South Africans, we've seen let's call it a constitutional experiment unfold in front of us. We were the guinea pigs in this experiment, and a lot of promises were made, a lot of promises that the Constitution itself, as the document itself, will defend us, almost as if someone breaks into your house, the Constitution materializes and steps in between you and your attacker. Or anyone that tries to hurt you in any way or infringe on your rights. But I think what we've seen now over the decades is that there's been a lot of change in that sentiment. A lot of people are realizing, but the power doesn't really lie with the Constitution. And what I'm building up to now is something that I think Americans that will be particularly relevant to them in the coming years as they start interrogating their own constitutional order. We already see a lot of these elements coming to the fore in their own constitutional democracy. When it comes to the Constitution or a constitutional order, the power does not lie with the document. The power lies with the person interpreting that Constitution. He is the one who is holding the power, who is holding sovereignty, the man who is interpreting the Constitution, not the document itself. And this is something you've written about and talked about extensively. And I'd like to hear some of your thoughts as well on that sentiment, where that power lies in a constitutional order.
Yeah, Ernest, you referred to the birth, so to say, of the South African Constitution back in the middle of the 90s, the 1990s, and I think it's for a moment just appropriate to have a look at that. The adoption of the South African Constitution back at that time was met with considerable accolades. It was stated on numerous occasions that here you have the most wonderful constitution actually in the world. Why was that? Well, the main reason for that is that was actually seen by, and you refer to Americans, but not only by Americans, especially liberal Americans and also Europeans. That was actually seen as the most victorious moment, the triumph of liberal constitutionalism. The reason for that, the reason was not only because some kind of settlement was reached between the various struggling South African communities at that stage, but it's specifically met with so much praise because it was seen as the triumph of liberal constitutionalism. Now, specifically focusing on your question, one of the aspects of liberal constitutionalism, and I've already referred to one, namely only focusing upon the state and the individual and disregarding communities. But a very important additional aspect, also going to the very center of the idea of statist individualist constitutionalism, is this. Since you do not recognize communities, but only individuals, it is argued that all reasonable, all fair individuals are in the final analysis actually basically the same. There might be differences as to language, differences as to communal background, differences as to civilizational characteristics and so on. But from a true liberal point of view, that is really regarded as something which at best is marginal, which at best is extremely superficial. You can actually disregard it. So what does that translate to when you come to the interpretation of the Constitution? It translates into the following. Namely, it is regarded that everyone, every individual, and also every court dealing with this specific document we call the Constitution will read it and will eventually interpret it and apply it in by and large the same way. So in other words, a considerable integrity and a considerable reliability is attributed to the text of the Constitution, as if in the final analysis it can have but one meaning. Why? Because all people, fundamentally being the same, will interpret it in the same way. Now, that is a fundamental error. It disregards some of the most basic truisms in interpretive theory. Not only interpretive theory, but also in interpretive practice. And let me quickly say what this is. Whenever you interpret a document, be it the Bible, be it the Quran, I suppose, and also even the South African Constitution, the people who interpret the Constitution will be belonging and do in fact belong to a variety of what one might call interpretive communities. Now, the various interpretive communities are based in a variety of divergent and also conflicting ideological convictions, ideological assumptions, cultural assumptions, and civilizational assumptions. Apart from that, a constitution is specifically interpreted in order to achieve particular ideological goals. And the one set of one specific interpretive community, for example, would interpret the Constitution in order to achieve the goal of what in the book I also refer to as transformationism. The vision of transformationism, which in a nutshell simply translates into, by and large, a quite leftist state. That's basically what it boils down to. Cultural homogeneity in the first place, disregarding the variety of communities, disregarding specifically the claims of minority communities, and then also, since it is leftist, interpret the Constitution as in such a way as to achieve, as far as possible, equality, more specifically substantive equality. So it would by and large interpret the Constitution in a leftist way, both from a cultural point of view as well as from an economic point of view.
And it will
Now,
be
people might
outcomes
immediately
based.
say, well, how is it will be outcomes based? That's right.
Yeah.
So very often people would argue, a typical liberal argument would be, well, look, no, look at the Constitution. The words almost speak for themselves. The Constitution, that is something something one often hears. The Constitution clearly says so and so. That is actually not so. A Constitution never clearly says that or that. A Constitution only speaks through the interpretive community, which is the public service, the governing party, and in the final analysis, obviously also the courts. And they filter the meaning of the Constitution, the meaning of the seemingly clear provisions of the Constitution through a specific ideological filter, thus producing meanings which people who do not belong to that specific interpretive community would be astounded to find out that it's in fact interpreted in that way. So what we have found in South Africa, especially in the last 10, 12 years, is that the Constitution has in fact been interpreted in the light of and in accordance with, in pursuance of the leftist ideology of transformationism, thus producing not some kind of neutral speak for itself meanings, but specifically a meaning which is in conformity with leftist ideals.
And yeah, and I think while we're on that topic, you also mentioned in our conversation on my Afrikaans channel, you talked about something that I think is absolutely critical to what you're explaining here, and that is you talked about almost the pillars that a constitutional order hinges on. If any of these pillars were to fall, or any of these factors or parts of the foundation were to fall, the constitutional order itself would start to in Afrikaans would be verbrokkel, it would start to crumble. Could you give us some examples of these fundamental pillars that are absolutely critical to a constitutional order?
Ernst, okay, let me just get the question clear. The previous time we spoke about the fundamentals of constitutionalism, and then we also spoke about the three pillars of any constitution. I think you're referring to the latter.
Yes.
Right. That is an extremely interesting topic, and it's extremely topical for the present day South Africa. You see, the point is, very often, and that's also one of the essential aspects of, let's say, my theory, if I may be so presumptuous to say so, is that a constitution is never actually supreme. It might parade, it might be masquerading as supreme, which implies that everything which happens within that particular polity, also legislative action, executive action, and so on and so forth, as well as the actions of private people, must be in conformity with the Constitution, failing which it would be invalid and of no consequence. It also implies that the Constitution can change, and I use the word change on a calculated basis, that the Constitution can only change once the text is amended through textual amendment. Now, that is actually, that's one of the fundamental aspects of faith of liberal constitutionalism. And it is, once again, entirely wrong. The fact of the matter is that a constitution in conformity with, not with the constitution itself, but what is actually happening within the polity itself, more specifically the most important, most potent, most forceful socio-economic and political forces that enfold within society. In conformity with that, the constitution also changed, and that is a very important thing. So what you might be dealing with, you might be dealing with a document called the Constitution, and you look at the Constitution in the year 2022 today. But that Constitution might actually constitute a complete misrepresentation of what the actual Constitution entails. Why? Because without any amendment to the text of the Constitution might have been changed considerably. So that is really the background, I think, of the question that you're asking. So whenever one looks at the condition or at the state of the Constitution in order to try to determine what really does the Constitution provide for, you can begin with the text of the Constitution, but especially in a dynamic situation and in a tumultuous situation like that of South Africa, the Constitution might have, to a lesser or larger extent, already been superseded by forces stronger than the Constitution itself. And that brings me specifically to your question. What I'm saying is this, and possibly one can improve on that, but a constitutional order is essentially focused, or rather premised, on three pillars. The first one is there must be a consensual ideology. Or if not a consensual ideology, then at least a dominant ideology to which more or less all elites within society subscribe to. or if all do not subscribe to it, at least they must by and large be satisfied with it, and by and large, not be in a position to forcefully resist that particular ideology. That's the first one. I will demonstrate it through examples, specifically South African examples. The second thing, and that's a basic essential aspect also of constitutional theory, is that in order for the state and then for a constitutional order to sustain itself, the state through its various organs, more specifically the police service and the army, the defense force, must be in a position to exercise a monopoly of force, including violence. No other force, no private force, no force outside the state must be capable to effectively and convincingly challenge the organs of state. If so, well, then the constitution is under threat, and it might be falling by the wayside. It might be superseded by something else, a new constitution, or by chaos. And then the third interesting thing is this, that we're dealing with states. And the state, that's the third pillar, a state must have a national, and in order to describe it properly, graphically, must have a country-wide economy. So all citizens in a particular country must by and large be connected or be able to be connected with each other through an effective infrastructure. Now, that is something that was in place in South Africa back from 1910 up to fairly recently, up to 10, 12, 15 years ago. But all three those aspects, the ideology, the monopoly of state power, and the countrywide economic infrastructure are now falling by the wayside. Let me just, I think I'm going to first stop here and then give you, then you can ask another question. But just the following, it's an interesting thing. The infrastructure constituting the basis for a national economy is actually the substructure. It's the material substructure, so to say. And in the absence of such a substructure, the superstructure, to use Hegel and Marx in the same breath, the superstructure does not have the basis for an existence. So what has been happening in South Africa is this: the superstructure, and we can describe it now. The superstructure is being dismantled as a result of a variety of factors, as a result of which there is simply no more room for the ideological superstructure. Sorry, did I say the superstructure? I mean the substructure is crumbling, as a result of which the substrate for the ideological superstructure has no fitting to which it can fit into.
Professor Nande, yeah, you said
now.
Excuse me.
Yeah. No. That's now theoretically put. Okay, one should actually describe through what is happening in practice in present-day South Africa.
Yeah, because that's exactly where my the conversation was leading me to the next question, is because you said in our previous chat on my Afrikaans channel, you said that South Africa is currently in the midst of one of the most comprehensive political constitutional rearrangements since its establishment as a Union of South Africa in 1910. And I think in answering what you mean by that, you will be giving the examples to the previous statement that you made. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely so. Absolutely so. And it's interesting to do so. And it's also, I think it casts light on our situation if one highlights these three factors. What happened was this: more or less in the 1870s and thereafter in the 1880s and 1890s, after first the discovery of diamonds and thereafter after discovery of golds, South Africa at that stage divided into a variety of political units, republics, the two Boer republics and the two British colonies. as well as to a lesser or larger extent a variety of semi-independent African kingdoms. There were a variety of political units. But as a result of the infrastructure that was established at that stage, in those 2.5 decades up to the end of the 19th century, the substructure of a national economy was established. And the most interesting thing to focus upon is actually railroads. Railroads were really taking the lead at that stage. Already back in 1899, something like 70%, 70, it's a lot, not 17, 17, 70% of railroads in the later day South Africa was already in place. There were rail tracks between Cape Town and Joburg, the goldfields between Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Durban, Port Elizabeth, as well as Lorenzo Marx, and so on. So that created the basis of a national economy. So shortly after the Anglo-Boer War, which came to an end in 1902, further steps were taken in order to establish and to expand the infrastructure, specifically amongst others in the field of national roads, in the field of the construction of a large variety of dams and canals and so on. It is unbelievable what was done already, and it's interesting actually to focus upon that, to see what achievements there were by the then governments, one should say, because it was then still the four political units, but a tremendous amount of achievements. The Rand Water Board was already established in 1904, and together with that, a variety of other water boards, thus securing water supply for the large population, which at that stage was not there, but which was foreseen for the Pretoria Witwatersrand area. Okay, so one can continue. I just want to mention in that regard, specifically in the days of the first national party under Hertzog after 1924, there was a huge projects of constructing dams. And then once again, under the second national party government, specifically under Verwoerd in the 1960s and after his death in the 1970s, there was another spate of dams that were erected, dam walls that were erected, thus creating the basis for securing water supply. Now, so one can continue. So the point is, however, already back in 1910, that's the interesting thing, Ernst, already back in 1910, when the Union of South Africa came about, stated differently, when South Africa was established as a unitary state, in order to then supersede the four political units of the previous era, already at that stage, there was the basis of a national economy through the countrywide infrastructure was already established. So what actually happened is that the political unit that came about, considering everything that has happened in the era before that, the Anglo-Boer War, the fact that the Boer republics were destroyed by British imperialism and so on, but from a materialistic point of view, the Union of South Africa that came about as a political unit in 1910 can actually also be seen as a superstructure that came about and that was fit onto the material economic substructure that has been in formation for the previous 35 years. All right. So that was the infrastructure. Then the second thing was this. The ideology that came into existence as the consensual ideology, or at least a dominant ideology for the South African state back in 1910, was first the ideology of British imperialism. I mean, after all, South Africa was a British dominion. It was in a sense a British colony. In the final analysis, its foreign policy was still determined by the British authorities in Westminster, and so on and so forth. However, as a result of the fact that the Afrikaner factor at that stage was already growing stronger after the Second Anglo-Boer War ending in 1902, certain concessions were made by the British imperialists to the Afrikaners, such as equal language rights and so on. At the same time, the ideology also provided for the exclusion of blacks. Okay, the whole thing was based on a racial basis, on which, interestingly, all white components in society, both the Afrikaners and the English component, agreed. So it was first British imperialism, soon, however, afterwards to be superseded by Afrikaner nationalism, especially from 1924, when Herzog National Party came into power, the so-called pact government, together with the Labour Party, which was, interestingly, an English-speaking, fairly leftist party, but still it was a purely white party. So, but by and large, then, it was Afrikaner nationalism, then superseding British imperialism. That was the new dominant ideology. Now, that new dominant ideology held sway until, and some people will say until 1994, when the ANC came to power on the basis of the 1994, then 1996 constitution. But that's actually not so. That is actually not so. Afrikaner nationalism under the National Party already came to an end, to my mind, towards the end of the 1970s. At least from 1980 up to 1994, when the ANC finally came to power, there was actually no real leading ideology. Also not Afrikaner nationalism. The only basis upon which the white, or then the Afrikaner, mostly Afrikaner government of the time, from 1970s up to 1994, still found it able to govern, was thanks to the fact, and its opponents will say owing to the fact, that it very, very effectively possessed the monopoly of force, including violence. From 1910 through the British imperialist period, then after that, from 1994, the Afrikaner nationalist period, up to eventually 1994, there was no single occasion during which state power could or was challenged convincingly by any force, not the rebellion of 1914, not the Rand strike of 1924, not the Osaba brandwag in the 1940s, definitely not the ANC, Mkhonto we Sizwe, FAPLA, and so on, not the United Democratic, the UDF, United Democratic Front, in the late 70s and the 1980s, not at all. The Afrikaner government, the white government at that stage, was an extremely effective government. One could say, from a purely state point of view, an extremely successful government, because there was no way in which it could be challenged, not at all. So the monopoly of lawful force and violence was unchallenged completely within their power. And then, as far as the third factor is concerned, as far as the national infrastructure was concerned, a lot of projects were embarked upon, electricity and so on, roads. I've already referred to some of that. The infrastructure was expanded considerably, as a result of which the South African economy, for a very, very long time, through the wars and so on, managed to achieve an economic growth rate of around about 2.5% over a period of almost a century. That is up to 1994. So in 1994, then, a new state ideology was agreed upon, and that state ideology was finally written into the present constitution, in the preamble of the constitution, in section 1 of the constitution, and in section 2 of the constitution. And in a nutshell, that boils down to rainbowism. In other words, that's the idea of the statist individualist constitutionalism, and rainbowism. Then everyone is regarded as equal. Everyone would be treated equal. We don't recognize any races. There's non-racialism, not multiracialism. There are no races. It's non-racialism. No cultural communities, nothing. Okay, so that was the idea of non-racialism. Now, so when the African National Congress came into power in 1994, and after that, that was the state ideology. At that stage, it inherited an extremely well-functioning state. There's no question about that. It might be politically incorrect to say so, but it is an incontrovertible truth. There's no question about that. And it also inherited, in spite of crippling sanctions, a well-functioning economy still, and a well-functioning national infrastructure. And I think I must first stop there before we continue as to what has happened since 1994.
Because that's a fascinating piece of background, Professor. But I also think it's a crucial piece of context, because that is pretty much if we were talking about a series of books, that would be the first book would just cover the lead up. If this was a narrative, if this was a fictional story, and then in the second book you would get the new dispensation, because that's what happened. As my friend Robert Daigen talks about, the changing of dispensation, where you come now to, as you now described, the rainbowism dispensation, the Rainbow Nation dispensation, the post 1994 or post apartheid dispensation, the ANC dispensation, whatever you want to call it. All those names refer to the same thing. And that thing, the post 1994 South Africa, that dispensation is now coming under considerable stress. And that's what you are talking about when you say we are going through a political constitutional transformation in South Africa, but not the type of transformation that the ANC want necessarily. But that's why I think that's so crucial, because that will get us eventually then in this conversation to the deserts of disorder that I titled this conversation after. But before we get to the deserts of disorder, can you give us paint us the picture now in the post 1994 world? After you've given us now the background story, you've given us the context. Where did this all lead now?
Yeah, Ernst, please accept my apologies for perhaps spending too much time to that, but I think the context that you've referred to is actually very important, because it gives one a kind of a comparative framework, a comparative angle. One should also have that background in order to judge to what extent the present dispensation is performing or malperforming. Now, okay, the first one then is the ideology. We deal with the three pillars. The first one then, the pillar of a state ideology. Now, for the first number of years, the first 5-6 years after 1994, it appeared as if rainbowism was firmly in place. It went along with the considerable accolades that the South African Constitution received internationally. It also went along with Mandela magic and so on. So with the fact that many people were relieved that eventually South Africa did not sink into a bloody conflict. Right. Now, whenever I discuss this, actually the first time I discussed this was not that very long ago. As a matter of fact, I think I first discussed it with you. But I also gave a lecture at the University of Pretoria on this, and I should say that not 2 days ago, yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was invited by previous colleagues at the Department of Jurisprudence of the University of Pretoria, mainly, and I don't think they will blame me if I say so, mainly black leftist guys. I gave this lecture also there. So what happened is this. In 1998, Samuel Huntington, I should focus upon that, was on visit in South Africa just after the publication of The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. Now, the basic thesis of Huntington was that the world is by and large divided into a number of civilizations, 7 of them. And wherever these civilizations met, you have a clash of civilizations. A long-term clash, stretching over centuries, if not millennia. He referred to Christianity clashing with Islam and so on and so forth. Let's not go into the detail of that now. But you have this clash of civilizations. And it is also possible, and there are a number of such instances, where 2 or more civilizations meet each other in one country. There you have what he referred to as a cleft state. Now, he did not deal in any detail with South Africa, but he did say a couple of things. Right at the beginning of the book, page 27, 28, around about there, where he said that, where he basically insinuated at least that South Africa was indeed a country where such a clash of civilization could occur or should be occurring, at least in terms of the general thesis, and is therefore a cleft state, because what do you have here? You have Western civilization meeting sub-Sahara civilization. He also added that in the second generation after the adoption of the Constitution, so in other words, say 20, 25 years after 1994, the clash would actually really emerge once you have a new generation of Black intellectuals. At that occasion, he was also on visit in South Africa. He gave a lecture at a couple of places, also at the University of Johannesburg, and I had the honor of attending it. Now, in that lecture, he basically repeated the basic thesis of his book. But needless to say, it obviously caused a little bit of consternation among the audience, even though the patrician Huntington was very tactful, very diplomatic. He did not want to upset people who at that stage was still in the throes, so to say, of rainbowism and the wonderful constitution and so on. But at least he was questioned, and eventually Judge Johan Kriegler, at that stage, Justice of the Constitutional Court, was called to the stage in order to say a word of thanks. And what Judge Kriegler basically did, and I don't blame him that much for that, because he didn't only speak for himself, he spoke for many, many South Africans at that stage, said, no, Professor Huntington, that's not my words. Essentially, you're actually wrong. You might be right for the rest of the world, but as to South Africa, you're actually talking rubbish. He didn't say so. Obviously, he was a little bit more tactful than that. Because here we have succeeded in overcoming the clash that you might be speaking about. It's not prevalent here. There's no clash here. We precisely have overcome it with rainbowism. Okay? Now, what has happened since then is that Kriegler and the many others who thought like him were proven wrong. Not wrong, completely wrong, for a number of reasons. Essentially for three reasons. In the first instance, already at that stage, there were a small number of Afrikaners who were not that satisfied with the dispensation, arguing that what has come about here was actually a one-party dominated state. It was not really democracy. It was a voting democracy, a polling democracy, an electoral democracy. That's the word I'm looking for. But it was not really a democracy in the fullest sense of the words. That was the first voices that went up. But then already at that stage, there were a small number of Africanist people, both in politics as well as in academia, saying, look, this whole constitution is a farce. It's a farce because Black people has been defrauded. Because although the ANC representing the vast majority of Black people was now in office, they were not in power. Specifically because they were excluded from economic power. And all the economic power, the argument went, still vested in whites, in English, Afrikaners, Jews, and so on, and also some international formations. Since that time, this voice questioning the ideology of rainbowism has become stronger and stronger and stronger. The guys where I gave this lecture yesterday, they all shared this view. This was just a fraud. So this Africanist or Azanianist thinking, this trend of Azanianist thinking has become exceptionally potent and is challenging all the basic tenets of rainbowism. So really, there's no consensus anymore. A vast percentage of especially very vocal Black intellectuals and politicians are in fact questioning this. And then there's a third factor, and this is that politics, in a sense, normal politics, that is playing out within Parliament and in a sense also in the courts, albeit in different, namely legal terms, has in a sense fallen by the wayside. It has at least become less and less important. More important now is what is actually happening outside Parliament, especially in the field of organized crime. There's no ideology in that. It is simply organized crime syndicates, and that's a topic on its own, but I should mention it here, where no ideology at all is actually recognized, where the only mode of conduct is simply, well, South Africa is in a sense a carcass as a result of state failure, and every possible criminal mafia, and there are many of them, and they grow stronger and stronger, especially the last 3-4 weeks. There's been a lot in the news about that, a lot of discussion. That is also contributing towards the final crumbling of the ideology. So that's the first thing. Now, an interesting thing in the question, the point that you make, that it's important to have this discussion against the background of 1910 up to 1994. I noted a while ago, I said a while ago that the ideology of Afrikaner nationalism already fell apart towards the late 1970s. Nevertheless, the National Party was still capable of remaining in power. Why? Well, basically thanks to, at that stage, a very effective defense force and police force. What do you have at the moment regarding the second factor? No. We have 160,000 police officers. And since, when was it, 3-4 weeks ago that the two of us have spoken, I think there has even been more indication, more evidence of our completely ineffective police force. Police force, I don't think one can actually use the word force anymore. Well, okay, they call themselves police services, but also not really a service. And I recognize the good work being done by the few good police officers that are left, but still, there is no way in which anyone at that stage could claim that the organs of state, police and army, still exercise the monopoly of force. Just two factors. The upheaval that we had last year in KZN, where there was basically an insurrection and complete failure of the police and the army to, in the first place, foresee what could happen, because there was no intelligence at all, and then secondly, to actually meet the problems when they occur. That explains it. That proves it. And then secondly, all these mafias that we're speaking about, the construction mafia, the road truck mafia, the Zama mafias in the mines, the taxi mafia, and so we can continue, indicating that crime in South Africa is simply out of hand, and that the organs of state responsible for those functions are completely incapable of meeting these challenges. I think the right way to actually, Ernst, to summarize it is as follows. I think there's no single private formation of hard force, a criminal syndicate, or a private security institution. I should say there are 500 private security officers, 9,000 to 10,000 private security companies, and so on. But no single one of them is capable of challenging the police. That is true. However, and that's the important thing, however, the police is simply, together with the army, is simply totally incapable to enforce state power over the entire national territory. That's the crucial matter. So what do you have as far as this is concerned? You have only certain spots, only certain demarcated, fairly small demarcated areas where you still have, in some cases, a fairly large measure of law and order, civilized life, safety, and so on, thanks to the police, but much more so to private security and to the activities of neighborhood watches, and so on and so forth. So what we have in South Africa is that you actually have a number of oases where you have law and order, safety, and so on. And for the rest is a desert of lawlessness. That is what is happening, and it's important to actually emphasize that is the topographical, so to say, situation. Only a few spots of law and order. And then we move on to the third factor, the third pillar. And the third pillar is the infrastructure. Now, one can refer to roads, one can refer to railroads. South Africa, I referred to railroads right at the beginning of our discussion. I don't know how many kilometers of rail tracks have been stolen in South Africa, but it must be thousands of kilometers, thousands of them. As a result of which, in many places, you simply don't have.
In my previous conversation with Russell Lamberti, I actually used a photograph of stolen railroad tracks as the thumbnail or the image of the conversation, because it becomes so iconic of the de-development of South Africa, as he says.
Absolutely so. That's spot on. Now, okay, we can refer to Eskom. All modern economies are electricity economies. All of us know that. But this government is so incompetent right from the beginning, from the time of Mandela, through Mbeki, who had all kind of pretenses to be such a clever president. They were simply complete failure to look at electricity. Back in 2001, Eskom, our utility responsible for the supply of electricity, still received an international recognition for being a leader in the field of electricity generation and supply and so on. That's 21 years ago. In the meantime, it has fallen by the wayside, as a result of which the growth of the South African economy is severely suppressed as a result of that. Now, okay, so the point is, at this moment, we have less and less and less a national and countrywide economic infrastructure, leading to exactly the same kind of scenario that I've referred to in relation to law and order, namely that you also only have certain spots, mainly thanks to a few municipalities. Let's say that a few municipalities which still succeed in providing basic services, roads, and so on. But over and above that, thanks to private ventures, which keeps whatever could be kept alive. So once again, you have these spots, these small demarcated spots. So not only in relation to law and order, the second factor, but also in relation to the economic factors, you have this kind of spot scenario all over the country, where you have economic activity, real economic activity, only in a few spots. I think you can identify them. The eastern suburbs of Pretoria, the northern suburbs and certain eastern suburbs, perhaps also some western suburbs of Johannesburg, the Western Cape, the Southern Cape, Mossel Bay, George, and so on. Certain areas in the West Coast, and then a couple of towns. But apart from that, in many other places, economic activity has simply, to a large extent, come to a standstill. Even big metropolises such as Mangaung, Bloemfontein, is completely dysfunctional, and the same applies to many other cities. KZN, I had a long discussion today with people in the financial and economic sphere. The amount of investment that is currently made in KZN, which is supposed to be the third or the second richest province in South Africa, has stopped. It's too dangerous to make any investments there. Moreover, the rail tracks and so on, all is gone. So the point is that in South Africa at the moment, you have only demarcated spots in which you have, I repeat now, just to summarize, which you have real economic activity, and also in which you have real safety and security. And most importantly, that is to a considerable extent, thanks to the efforts not of the state, but it's there in spite of the state. It's thanks to the efforts of community organizations, of business people, the private sector, and but not the state. That is the most these are the fundamental facts regarding to the second and the third pillars for sustaining a constitution. So all three together then with the first one have fallen by the wayside, has crumbled. As a result of which I think we are as a result of of which I think the conclusion must be that the change of the constitutional order is in full swing. There's no question about that. At the moment, we still speak of the Supreme Constitution, and courts still give judgments on that basis. And yes, you have in many cases still private law, which is functioning thanks to good attorneys and good advocates and so on. Yes, but by and large, the fundamental pillars of a constitutional order, of the old constitutional order, not only the one that has come about in 1994, 1996, but the South African constitution that came about or the South African state that came about with union in 1910 has fallen by the wayside. There's nothing basically is left, and I can see no new factor coming up which is capable of actually turning the direction of the constitutional dynamics in another direction. The interesting thing, perhaps we can speak a little bit about that, is if there is a new constitution or a multifaceted new constitutional order or orders, what would it look like? And if we would be seeking for an ideology, what would that ideology look like? What would the content of that be?
Professor, I think the section that you just described there, the three pillars, and well, firstly you described how when they were present in South Africa, and how you've described their crumbling. I have two questions left. One of them relates to what you were just talking about, but I think the two questions that I have left, one of them still has I suspect, a negative answer. So I'm going to ask that question first, and then I want to end on the more uplifting, hopeful answer of the second question. So the first question that I want to ask you before we say goodbye is, what does that we've focused a lot on South Africa, but a lot of my listeners are listening from America, they're listening from Europe, they're listening from all across the world. And a lot of them live in constitutional democracies or in liberal constitutional democracies. What does the future hold for them? If you're using someone in the chat earlier, I think it was Rick said, you are the South African Odin, because I know Odin also has a blind eye that he can see the future with, if I get my mythology right now. If you can use that eye of yours, Professor Malan, if you're looking at the Western countries, at the Western democracies, and at the United States, in Europe, all these countries, do you see the sands of the deserts of disorder creeping in, or what do you see on the horizon for their constitutional orders, taking your experience in South Africa as your guide?
Yeah, liberalism has basically given rise to multiculturalism, and multiculturalism is the basis of, it's the poison for actually finally undermining liberal democracy in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Western Europe. The reason for the accolades that the South African Constitution received almost 30 years ago was precisely because this was also a liberal constitution, actually following the example of these liberal constitutions that I've just referred to, and actually laying the basis of this kind of multicultural democracy in South Africa, which was then also the example for Europe and the United States. So for that reason, the experience of South African constitutionalism for the past 20, 25, 30 years, the importance for that, for Western Europe and for United States, is actually very, very important. What it shows is that the experiment of multiculturalism, rainbow nation, and so on, has produced a complete failure. The warning should be, do not try the same. We were now the experiment. the experiment has proven to be a failure. So it would be really unwise if you've witnessed the failure unfolding in front of your eyes to proceed with something of the same kind in your own countries. You might still have time to put things right, to correct the ideas of extreme forms of liberalism, extreme forms of multiculturalism, and in that way there can still be a chance for Western Europe and the United States and the United Kingdom. The whole question of immigration and so on is a severe threat. I know I might be made out for far right or whatever, but I really don't mind. That is actually an litmus test. It is, if you really embrace that, then you actually embrace multiculturalism and this kind of extreme liberalism, and then you're digging the grave of the European states and the United States. So that is what it boils down to. Use this as the evidence for warning yourself not to go the same way. That basically is my answer as far as that is concerned.
Professor, and that now gets me to my my last question, and that is the silver lining in all of this, and that is when you paint the metaphor of the deserts of disorder, there are the oases within that desert where there's water to drink, where plants can grow, where life can survive. And you've touched on this, but I want you to condense it and focus on it for the last answer in this, or last part of this conversation. What is making those oases possible, and what is necessary for the creation of more of them?
Forceful communal action springing from the energies of well-organized cultural communities. I speak here from the experience of the Afrikaner community, which have succeeded over the past 20, 25 years of first finding its own feet and then realizing that the responsibility to create a future for itself lies nowhere else but only with itself. Afrikaners are spread over all of South Africa, but not densely. Afrikaners are living at a few spots actually. I think what one should be having is more and more territorializing, that is focusing, concentrating on only certain areas where there are already a considerable amount of informal but considerable self-government, autonomy, and self-rule. I think that in the first place is the first part of the answer, creating the basis for the first two pillars for a new multifaceted constitutional order, namely for economic activity. Economic activity is crucially important for creation of wealth, creation of the prerequisites for education, for a civilized life, and so on. And secondly, also very important for creating safety, not basing one's dependence or basing one's actions upon dependence upon the state, but on our own efforts, which to a considerable extent are already in place. And I think what should be happening is that other communities, African communities and so on, should in a sense follow the example of Afrikaners, or perhaps follow their own examples, which they are also in their own histories. I know that there are in fact such examples, and I know that there are also an increasing amount of good cooperation between Afrikaner communities through various Afrikaner organizations and such African communities. And that actually brings us to a kind of ideology, a kind of new ideology for the territory of South Africa, not so much, or the area of South Africa, not so much for the South African state anymore, because that is increasingly only a nominal, something with a nominal meaning. But then creating space for all communities through a new ideology, which, if I can encapsulate it in a few words, should be, as a good old friend of mine, something somebody who in the Afrikaner world has done a lot of work, a lot of philosophical work in the field of political philosophy, has said already 22 years ago, so that you could have not a liberal state, not only rainbowism, or not the farce of rainbowism, which never actually was, but a community of communities based on a considerable amount of self-government for the various communities and cooperation among them. And I think as far as Europe is concerned, as far as the United States is concerned, they can still kind of save their states, save their communities through properly safeguarding the cultural integrity of those communities as essentially Western communities as Western states.
Well, Professor, I think that's the perfect place to end this absolutely incredible conversation. I've really enjoyed it, but I always enjoy talking to you about these topics that you are so knowledgeable on. So, I mean, I didn't expect anything else. I just want to thank you for your time tonight. I know it's already a bit late for these very deep conversations, but maybe this is the time when these type of conversations happen naturally anyway throughout history. But thank you again. Thank you very much for your time. And before we go, I just want to give you the opportunity to where can people find your work if they want to go read what you write or want to go read your books? Where can they find them as a last way if they liked what they heard here today or you tickled their curiosity?
Yeah, basically, fortunately, the two books are available quite readily on the internet. The first book, Politocracy, a critique of statist individualist constitutionalism. And sorry, I'm mixing up the two books. Politocracy, well, you can just type in Politocracy, Koos Malan. You would get that for free on the internet. As a matter of fact, you don't have to buy it. It is available in bookshops, Protea bookshops in South Africa itself. The other book, There is No Supreme Constitution, is also available at academic bookshops in South Africa, specifically Protea Bookshop, which have branches all over South Africa. And it's also available on Google Books, Amazon, and so on.
Perfect. No, well, thank you very much. And I would highly recommend people go check out those books and even get your hands on them. They are definitely very interesting and worth your time. Lastly, I just want to say thank you to all of you that tuned in. You had excellent commentary here on the side. I always read as many as I can while I'm still paying attention to what my guest is saying. But thank you very much. I really appreciate all of your kind words and all of your very insightful comments throughout this conversation. Because every time you put an insightful comment there, I can put it on screen and it is part of the conversation. People can read that while they are listening to this conversation. I really enjoy that. And you're part of the time capsule now of these types of conversations. So thank you very much. And if you're new to this channel and you like these types of conversations, you can subscribe to be let known when the next one comes on. I usually stream on a Tuesday at 7:00 Central Africa time. And then you can also, if you're not watching live, you can still take part in the conversation by leaving a comment in the comment section. I read all of them, respond to as many as I can. You can also leave a like. That helps out the show. But thank you, everyone. And Professor Malan, thank you once again for your time. I hope you have an excellent week, excellent weekend. And I hope the year is very kind to you and that you have a lot more books in your future that you can contribute to the larger conversation. I look forward to reading all of them.
Thank you, Ernst. It was an honor to be your guest, and thank you also to the attention of our listeners. Thank you.
All right. Cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless.